It's not just us who's having a general election. We all know it's happening in America. We are now in the primary season, which principally applies to the Republicans, who effectively the opposition. They're choosing their candidate. It does look pretty much like as it could be game over, and Donald Trump is going to be the candidate. These could be the most short-lived primaries you've ever seen. That means President Joe Biden might get his wish, because it wasn't so long ago when the clear Democrat strategy was Trump for candidate, Biden can beat him. Beaten him once before, will beat him again. I would suggest, and the polls seem to back this up, that is not as clear-cut as it might have seemed then. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome to the show, for the first time, Inge Kemptrup, who is a former chair of Democrats abroad in the UK. Inge, hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Well, I'm really pleased because I'm a great believer in trying to get sort of two views, particularly abroad. We Brits can think we know it all sitting here, and actually hearing from the horse's mouth what's going on the other side, I think can be very informative. So, interesting article. It appeared in the Times by Justin Webb. This was essentially, and I think it came out yesterday, it might have been today, but it was essentially making the case that it was the Democrat strategy to be taking on Donald Trump because he'd been beaten once before. He could be beaten again. That, I would put to you now, is not perhaps looking as such a good bet, is it?
Well, it's sort of interesting to talk about the Democrat strategy, because I think what I'm watching the Republicans go is that, yes, there seems to be an inevitable point towards Trump. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety in the party about electing someone other than Donald Trump. But let's remember, we're at the start of this process, and the voters have to pick who their candidates are for the respective process. We've just had the first foray in the whole primary and caucus process with the Iowa primary the other night, the Republican caucus. And this is going to be continuing through the summer. So we're at the very start. And the point of this is that the American voters get to decide, and we won't actually know who the candidates are till later. Is it inevitable? Maybe, but I was very intrigued by the fact that he got 51%. This is not like an overwhelming number. I thought, well, that's quite intriguing, actually. One might have expected more in that case. And we'll see how that continues throughout the year. I will comment, and I don't know if this is something you've discussed, that there are concerns about how Trump is appearing in public. The other day, he was speaking about Nikki Haley mistaking her for Nancy Pelosi and going on in some detail. And he's had very many errors like this, perhaps mistakes of speech. I don't know, but it seems to be increasing. So I guess we don't know what's happening. And one of the questions I have, can Trump last for the whole year?
I find this
is he going to make it for a rigorous center? I don't know.
I mean, you ask a question, and I find it quite fascinating, because there are people over here who think it is genuinely unfair that President Biden, who is himself making mistakes quite repeatedly. Now, I'm stripping out all those that are fake and that appear on social media and twisted up. He is not showing cognitive assurance on a number of occasions himself. And that, you know, forgive me, that must be a worry that he does a President Johnson back in, I think it was 67 or 68, that he could conceivably pull out. He might face family pressure to pull out, because he does not seem to be as robust cognitively as you're suggesting might be the case with Trump.
I mean, I find that kind of commentary sort of fascinating. There seems to be kind of a dissonance between this message that some people have that Biden is having difficulties cognitively.
Well, he does with names and things as well. He gets names wrong. You know, he does make the mistakes that you're saying you're worried that Trump's doing, which he's done.
Yeah. I don't think to the same extent. But, you know, this is kind of a subjective thing.
It is.
Let's think about one thing. It doesn't happen very often that an incumbent does not end up being the nominee. You mentioned the example of Johnson.
Yeah, back
Johnson
in 68.
pulled out before he actually came, before the election happened. And if you remember, the candidate lost in the end to Nixon in 1968.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So it's not exactly a parallel example.
But he pulled out.
To me, what's amazing, as I heard from someone, Joe Biden could be 100 years old. They don't care, because look at all the stuff that he's done. These are the things that we're seeing over the past 3 years. You know, the Infrastructure Act,
sure,
the gun safety laws, just this incredible host of stuff. I wouldn't have guessed that he would have gotten as much done as he has.
Why is he polling so badly then?
I think it kind of depends also what polls you read. I don't worry so much.
No, I think no. I'm not going to let you get away with that. I think the question, you've got. I think we need a little bit of brutality here. He is polling, actually, behind Trump if he's the candidate. That is a remarkable situation when you think of the criminal charges Donald Trump is facing. He seems to be going from strength to strength. Now, it's not a big gap, but it is a gap.
Yeah, this is, okay, so we'll agree to disagree politely on polls. And there also are other ones that have come up that have quite the opposite result. But we'll continue with that. But what we're seeing is the start of the process. And we are fascinated, you and I and a lot of other folks who look at this closely. But let's remember that a lot of people aren't following it in the same way. People tend to make up their minds as the primaries get close. One thing to remember is March 5th is a big date for primaries. There's going to be about, I think it's like 12 states are going to be voting then.
Is that Super
right now,
Tuesday,
it's very,
I think.
very early
Super
days.
Tuesday, you call it, don't you?
Super Tuesday. And little known fact, Democrats abroad, we have our own presidential primary. We have it around the world. We have it in the week of March 5th to 12th. If there are any Americans overseas listening to this call, I'll give a little plug to votefromabroad.org so they can register, and also to democratsabroad.org, because that's where we're running the information about the primary. And I hope you'll tune back in as we get closer to that.
You can rest assured with
events and electronic.
You can rest assured. Look, I know you said we're going to agree to disagree. I know you said we're going to agree to disagree on polls, and whilst I accept your point, with 289 days to go, a lot is going to happen, and more people focus their minds the closer you get. But actually, the Harris poll, Harris X poll, it had Biden on 40 and Trump on 43. So I promise you, there is. It's bad news, I'm afraid, but the fact is Trump is ahead. So there is, but it's narrow. It's in the margin of error. Shall we agree on that? But let me ask you something else. You are absolutely spot on when you say we are only getting underway. And I know that politically might offer some comfort. But let me put this analysis to you. The 2020 election took place in circumstances that I think Joe Biden benefited from, because it was, campaigning from isolation. It was campaigning in rooms where he wasn't actually out there having to go through the huge stress of traversing the country. I mean, I don't know how the candidates do it at any age, let alone the age you've got Trump and Biden at. This election is going to be physically challenging for him, and indeed for Trump. Is he really going to be up for that? He's not campaigned like this for, 12 years?
Well, a couple of things. One, I remember March 2020 quite clearly.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, we had our primary here, and it was one of the last things that happened before lockdown. So he was doing quite a lot of campaigning there, notably in South Carolina. And South Carolina in March 2020 was when we knew that he was going to be the nominee. You remember we had a whole slew of candidates running at that point. And at that point, the race changed, because you couldn't have the kind of public events. But
and
again,
traversing the country. I mean, it's huge. I mean, your country is a big country.
It is huge. It's sort of mind-boggling, really. I mean, something to be said for having an efficient 6-week period. Our campaigns just go on forever. I understand that. But, you think about, you see pictures of Biden bicycling. You see him out there being kind of vigorous. And then what do you see with Trump? He's in a golf cart. He's kind of just sort of making his way from point to point. I know they're both older men.
Maybe he's the sensible
be realistic,
one.
But
maybe he's the sensible one, conserving his energy. And we all know, we can all think in this country and your country how these demonstrations for the media of active presidents to defy the health issue end. I mean, poor old Jimmy Carter, one of the, I thought one of the most decent men in politics, and he went for a run, and it all backfired horribly. We had our own left-wing candidate for Prime Minister, Neil Kinnock, doing a little run by the sea and falling flat on his backside into the water. I mean, that's a risk, isn't it? Joe Biden gets on a bicycle. That is a risk, isn't it? Anything could happen.
Anything could happen, and let me tell you, it probably will between now and November. I have no doubt.
Okay, so let me just move this on a little bit, if I may, because you've got a situation where we are, I think, probably most likely, apart from maybe a little bit of a fill-up next Tuesday with Nikki Haley doing well in New Hampshire, you are most likely to end up facing Donald Trump as candidate. It's a fascinating position and hard for many of us to understand here, but he's going to be in court for lots of things. You probably can't talk about all his court cases. I appreciate that. But isn't the reality, the more he appears in court, the more popular he seems to get? I mean, did you ever factor that in? Can you factor that in?
Well, let's kind of think about what's gone on the past 2 years, putting his increasing number of court appearances to one side. There have been elections. Remember, we had a midterm. Traditionally, the party in power does not do well in the midterm, but in November 2022, we defied that. The Democrats did extremely well, keeping the Senate and doing well in the House, not keeping it as we would like to have. And there have been a number of interim elections in between that where we've done very well. Notably, and I don't know how much this is being picked up on, elections that have happened in the wake of the decision to change Roe v. Wade. In other words, to limit
abortion. Yeah, we won't go into the detail of that, but you're right. Yeah.
And one election after another. We've seen it in Wisconsin. Most recently, we've seen it in a lot of states. When women's rights are on the ballot and we can vote, we will vote. And it's going to be an enormous thing. And the Republicans don't have anything to say about that.
Well, except Trump has rode back a little bit on what was a very entrenched position on abortion. So he's not utterly insensitive to what's going on there. Listen, I really appreciate you coming on, because it's good to have a Democratic guest coming on and prepared to talk about what's going on there. I do hope we can invite you back. Inge Kemptrup, former chair of Democrats Abroad, thank you very much. And I hope you feel you had a decent hearing. You can join the conversation.